Hello everybody and welcome to the Drydock episode 332. This week the questions are taken from guide 407 on the Holland type submarines and the Wednesday video on the last stand of HMS Edinburgh up there in the Arctic Circle. So let's get on with questions. Tintin Cat wants to know what happened to any Kriegsmarine surface ships that survived World War II. Well, if we restrict ourselves to full destroyers and higher, so not including German torpedo boats, which very often were roughly the same size as destroyers, you'll find as we go through them quickly that a good chunk of them actually just ended up being transferred to the Marine Nationale or the Soviet Navy for post-war use, because both of those navies had been the most badly affected by the Germans. I mean, the Marine Nationale had almost been wiped out between ships sunk in action and Vichy ships scuttled as a result of the German attempted takeover in 1942. Pretty much the only surviving French warships at that point were, ironically enough, the Free French ships that had started off as Free French and some other French warships that were just not in metropolitan France at the time of the Vichy takeover, like Richelieu and Jean Bart. But in any case, the carrier Graf Zeppelin taken off to Russia and then used in weapons tests. Lutzow, the Deutschland-class light cruiser formerly known as Deutschland, technically was sunk, but was then refloated and used in weapons tests by the Russians post-war. An awful lot of surviving Kriegsmarine surface vessels, especially the large ones that were still around at the beginning of 1945, actually ended up being sunk in air attacks or being scuttled right towards the end of the war. Of course, Prince Eugen herself went off to become an atomic bomb test target at Bikini Atoll. The cruiser Leipzig, so all the Königsbergs are dead at this point, but Leipzig was used very briefly as a barrack ship and used for clearing mines, and then she was broken up for scrap. The Nürnberg, her sister ship, was used by the Soviet Navy as the Admiral Makarov and spent some time on frontline service before being turned into second-line service and then scrapped in the late 50s. Then that's pretty much it for the big ones, and then we're just down to a whole slew of destroyers that survived in various ways, shapes, or forms. So the Z4 went to Britain, but didn't do much after that, just scrapped at the end of the decade. Z5 went to France. Z6 also went to France. Z10 was used by the Royal Navy as a training ship and barrack ship for a few years and also scrapped before the end of the 40s. Z14 was used in Soviet naval service for an uncertain amount of time, but at least a decade. Z15 was also used by the Soviets in active naval duty, although for only a short period of time, then, much like with the British vessels, training ship, barrack ship, scrapped. Z20, also Soviet Union, brief period in active service, then a training ship. Z23, over to the French, although she was again technically sunk in harbour, but she was salvaged and used for spare parts for the other destroyers that the French had in service from the Kriegsmarine. Z25 was used in the Marine Nationale for just over a decade. Z29 was allocated to the US, but not really in condition to be taken over to the US, and so was scuttled the year after the war ended. Z30 was used by the British as a test ship to see what happened when you blew things up underwater near a large destroyer, and then broken up after a couple of years of that. Z31 went to the French Navy, again with frontline service for just over a decade. Z33 went to the Soviet Navy, and also went into active service with them for just under a decade. Z34 was, again, partly damaged, assigned to the US, but scuttled very soon after the end of the war. Z-38 was used as a test ship by the Royal Navy for a few years until they too badly damaged her in an explosion trial, and Z-39 was sent over to the US, and they actually used her for quite a significant series of experiments until they sent her over to the French Navy, where she served with them for almost 2 decades, actually, before being broken up, although she was used again as a spare parts repository for a good chunk of that. And Z-39 is actually where we get most of the reasonably clear high-res photos of German destroyers from World War II, and most of those are taken from her time in the States. Captain Seafort asks, other than Holland's Holland-type submarines and Armstrong's Elswick cruisers, are there any other cases of a particular type of warship becoming almost synonymous with a single manufacturer? Although not necessarily quite as strong an association, there was a certain movement in the latter part of World War II, particularly among the US Navy, where a lot of escort carriers became referred to as Kaiser carriers because of the Kaiser shipyards mass-producing the Casablanca class. Now, of course, obviously, not all escort carriers were built by the Kaiser shipyards, and in the Royal Navy and so forth, they would still continue to refer to them by their various class designations and so forth. But when you look through what people were saying in terms of, veterans accounts and so forth, and even in some communications, official ones that is, the generic use of Kaiser carrier, which competed with Jeep carrier quite a bit, does hang around for a little bit of time at least. Outside of that, I think for the most part, you're either looking at really small production runs like the Popovs, or otherwise most other warships just tend to be built in much larger numbers and therefore by multiple shipyards, or they represent such a small subtype of the overall class distinction that there isn't really a chance for them to distinguish themselves beyond and above in order to have the single manufacturer take up the nomenclature for the entire type. The only other ready example that comes to mind is the Thames gunboats, and that's mostly because they're built on the Thames, by some of them by Thames Iron Works, and kept in sheds for after the Crimean War, and used extensively in the second part of the 19th century, but that's a little bit of a niche thing, I think. The man formerly known as Commenting Is What I Do asks, had war in Europe broken out earlier, how effective do you think the gas or petrol-electric submarines would have been in comparison to their diesel-electric successors, and did they have any chance of matching U-boat tonnage? Well, we actually have a kind of point of comparison for this, in as much as, roughly speaking, the first 20 German U-boats that went into service were all kerosene or petrol-powered anyway, with diesel-electrics, I believe, starting with U-20. And that's just the U series, not counting the UBs and UCs and so on and so forth. So we can actually look at, how did the petrol-powered German U-boats do? And some of them had relatively impressive sinking lists. The main disadvantage of the petrol-electric boats in overall terms, especially compared to the early diesel-electric boats, yes, they're slightly slower on the surface. Yes, they have slightly shorter range. And yes, obviously the mechanics, not just in terms of efficiency, but also in terms of safety of petrol-electric is not as good as diesel-electric. But it becomes a harder thing to compare because the size of submarines is rapidly increasing. So, for example, U-17 compared to U-32, U-32 has much better statistics and is a diesel-electric compared to U-17 being a petrol-electric, but also U-32 displaces around about 100 tons, give or take, more, which, considering that U-17 is in the 500 to 550 ton displacement range, is actually quite a considerable increase. They both actually have the same armament of 4 tubes forward, 2 tubes aft, 6 torpedoes total, and a deck gun. So in that respect, there's not really much to write home about between them. It's just, the diesel-electric is a bit faster and a bit longer range, but how much of that is a function of having roughly 20 to 25% more internal volume and displacement to play with as compared to its power plant? That's harder. And then, of course, when you get to Allied subs, like you can see here, C-38, that is, again, a more difficult comparison because the earlier petrol-electric subs are shorter range and smaller, and therefore less capable in broad terms than later, longer-distance diesel-electric units. So in absolute terms, their performance would be worse, but how much of that is a product of just the fact they're smaller subs? Would a diesel-electric sub at that same size have much better or worse performance? I suspect probably not a huge amount outside of the safety issues of petrol versus diesel in the surface running. The biggest drawback, it had war broken out earlier, would simply be they're smaller subs, they can't go as far or hang around for as long and don't carry as many weapons. But to a certain extent, war in Europe, especially if we're talking about the Channel, the southern part of the North Sea, and the immediate environs of western approaches, it doesn't actually matter too much. Where it starts to matter more is as the war progresses and more U-boat interceptions are attempted further out into the Atlantic, further north into the North Sea. That's when the additional range and endurance granted by being larger and diesel electric helps, but whether a larger petrol electric submarine could have done 95% of that job, well, we'll never know. Brendan Buersdorf asks, I'm curious about what makes a submarine chaser, well, a sub-chaser. There are patrol boats, corvettes, sloops and frigates that all seem to do a similar job of sub-hunting, so what makes a sub-chaser designated as such? It doesn't seem to be size, because some of them are similar in size to a Flower-class corvette. Well, originally the name and title goes back to the original concept of the first submarine chasers in World War I, which ironically was a role that they pretty much never actually fulfilled, because when they were initially thought up, there wasn't actually any way of countering submarines underwater, so the only way to deal with them was to attack them on the surface, and the idea was for a small, relative to submarine at least, fast attack vessel that could do patrols and essentially, well, as the title suggests, chase a submarine. When a submarine comes to the surface, it would be small enough to be produced in mass numbers so they could cover a wide area, but fast enough to track down a submarine and then engage it in a surface gun battle. So they had to be heavily armed, even though they generally would displace even less than the relatively small submarines of World War I. The reason I say they pretty much never filled that role is because although they did fulfill most of that mission profile, by the time they actually started being brought into service, depth charge launchers and early hydrophones were in effect, so they could actually not just chase down subs on the surface, they could also act in a properly anti-submarine role in terms of trying to track them down underwater, where of course the speed advantage of the sub-chaser is even greater, and then lob a depth charge or two at the target sub. So that's the origin of the name. Literally, they were designed to independently patrol and hunt down submarines, as opposed to oceanic escorts, which were more tied to the convoys, although later on some submarine chasers did actually end up escorting convoys. As time went on, late World War I into the interwar period and then World War II, sub-chaser became a nomenclature that was applied to a certain spectrum of specifically dedicated anti-submarine warfare vessels that displaced in the hundreds of tons, usually towards the lower end of that spectrum. Then the corvette comes along, which is at the upper end of the hundreds of tons, thanks to the British, and is more of an convoy escort vessel, whereas a submarine chaser is still, although ended up being used in World War II, ended up being used quite a lot in convoy escort, theoretically still has this mission profile of independent hunting of enemy submarines. The reason why some of the later US theoretical submarine chasers, dash patrol, escort vessels, etc., approach the size of a corvette is actually, yes, they are the size of the corvette, but it's just a reflection, I think, of the general scope of size increase in all ships, because although that particular class of US submarine chaser is within 50 to 100 tons of the displacement of a Flower-class corvette, by the time that class of submarine chaser is being introduced into US service, the latest anti-submarine corvette class of vessels are the Castle-class corvettes, which have now just about managed to tip over into four-figure displacements, and the River-class twin-screw corvettes, aka frigates, which are a couple of hundred tons more still. So I think if you were going to put together a very loose definition of what makes a sub-chaser versus a corvette or a frigate, it would be that the corvette or frigate is primarily designed for oceanic convoy escort work, and although primarily is an anti-submarine vessel, does have a limited degree of capability in anti-surface and perhaps in the later corvettes and larger frigates, a small amount of anti-aircraft protection as well, whereas a sub-chaser is going to be considerably smaller, usually in the low hundreds of tons, although, as we said, later on that could get into the high hundreds of tons displacement, and is pretty much exclusively designed for anti-submarine warfare. Any anti-surface or anti-air capability is usually incidental or very kind of tacked on, like maybe a 20mm Oerlikon or something. And at least in theory, their operational profile is supposed to be independent hunting of submarines, even though they would often end up escorting ships as well. And they usually, again, wouldn't be full oceanic vessels, they would be coastal vessels, but as their size got larger and necessity dictated, they may then be brought in to full convoy escort work, either on shorter distance convoys or with mid-ocean refueling, perhaps even the bigger ones. Warrant Officer Will asks, I recently saw a photo of a model of HMS A13. While I'm familiar with why future submarines would drop this sort of streamlined design, I'm nevertheless curious with what the potential underwater speed characteristics of submarines from World War I and World War II could have been if they had maintained such dedicated designs. So what he's referring to here, for those of you who might not understand, is the fact that the submarine's outer casing, especially up top, would gradually be built up more and more to support a deck gun, crew, reloading, and more especially to form the bow in a way that made the submarine a better vessel on the surface, because that's where a lot of submarines from World War I and World War II tended to spend the majority of their time rather than underwater. Whereas back at the beginning, so A13 is obviously an A-class submarine of the Royal Navy, they're, as you can probably see, very closely derived from the Holland class boats, which started everything out for the Royal Navy and various other navies. And at this point, you could almost think that the A-class, especially A13 here, resembles kind of a whitehead torpedo with the front slightly blunted and a small superstructure on top. But in terms of how fast could submarines have gone if they had stuck with a profile that was better adapted for underwater work than surface work, well, we actually, luckily, have a few data points which we can look at to suggest what kinds of speeds might have been achieved. So for World War I, we can go from A13 over to the R class, which hopefully from that transition you appreciate in many ways, shapes and forms actually resembles just a slightly elongated hull form compared to A13. So pretty much a similar hull that looks kind of like an early torpedo, blunted a little bit at the nose in this case for the fitting of a bunch of torpedo tubes, and in the R class's case with a tall but relatively overall small superstructure stuck on top and a little blister right up front to help with seakeeping, because they would still be on the surface at times. And that's because, of course, the R class, as I've covered in a previous video, were designed pretty much as the world's first hunter-killer submarines, albeit without guided torpedoes. They're supposed to use a hydrophone array to hunt down enemy subs and then shotgun with this series of torpedo tubes up front. And these subs were capable of about 14 to 15 knots underwater and were actually slower on the surface. So, broadly, if submarines in the First World War had followed the trend of aiming for higher underwater than surface speeds for whatever reason, the mid-teens of knots is probably what you would have been looking at. Obviously, they didn't end up building a much bigger sort of J or K class sized sub with such optimization, so we don't know how the square cube law would have helped with that in terms of getting more power down range and therefore the sub through the water, but that would have been about reasonable, I would say. And then as we progress to World War II, you could look at the Type 21 and Type 23s, but there were some compromises in those designs to allow for mass production, so I would actually rather look at this thing, which is the Japanese number 71 submarine, built immediately before World War II, and hopefully again, as the transition shows, this is pretty much a continuation of that exact same hull form. You can see it's essentially a gigantic torpedo with a small superstructure, and in this case a slightly longer nose fairing. As it's an experimental sub, it doesn't have torpedo tubes, but then it's designed to have a little bit of capability for surface sailing, much like the R-class's little nose bump there. So essentially, this is the hull form. It's essentially torpedo, but bigger, with small sail or conning tower, depending on how you want to determine it. And if you absolutely have to, a little fairing or relative to other subs, relatively small fairing on the bow to assist with a degree of seakeeping while on the surface. So there's actually a fairly good continuity, and yes, I know this picture is flipped around. I've flipped it around expressly for the purpose of contrasting it with the models of A13 and the R-class, which are both pointing in from left to right. And this sub, as a test unit, was capable of around 21 knots underwater, and again, slower on the surface. And this design would actually be developed at the very end of the war into the I-201 class, which, once they'd equipped them with torpedo tubes and so forth, okay, the underwater speed dropped to around 19 knots, but still, that's pretty good. And then, of course, as I said, you can also refer to the Type 21 and Type 23 and some of the experimental German U-boats as well. So for the World War II period, whereas in the World War I period, I reckon 14, 15 knots is about what you'd expect for a underwater optimized submarine. In World War II, around 20 knots, give or take, would be what I would reckon you'd see for an underwater optimized submarine that doesn't have other compromises built in, like the need for modular mass production and so forth. BK Zhong asks, which valuables that were lost with a warship are you most personally interested in? I don't have one particular ship, I think. I mean, from a more, slightly more general perspective, I would be very interested if there was a warship out there that had been loaded down with a bunch of Inca artifacts, so it would have been a Spanish warship at that stage, which sank with them all aboard, because, well, I'm half Bolivian, I'm quite interested in Inca civilization, and a good chunk of Inca civilization that wasn't massive stonework was taken away and destroyed by the Spanish. But, annoyingly, as part of that taking away and destruction process, a massive chunk of everything that the Spanish looted was either broken up to extract gems, or if it was gold, silver, etc., was melted down and recast for transport across the oceans. So it's relatively unlikely that there's a Spanish warship out there loaded down with a bunch of Inca artifacts and so forth. It's much more likely that well, we know for a fact there are a bunch of Spanish warships out there loaded down with Inca gold and silver and gems, but as I said, mostly all melted down and cast into far less interesting pieces of eight and such like, because yeah, ultimately there's a bunch of ships out there with a ton of gold and silver and gems aboard, but they're gold and silver and gems. Whether you find it on one ship or another really doesn't make a huge amount of difference in terms of their monetary value. And if they've been turned into coins or bullion, their historic value is relatively minimal compared to actual artifacts. No particular reason I put Syracusia herself up here, because we don't actually know what happened to her. So, although if she did sink, finding her wreck would be quite interesting. But more overall, in terms of valuables lost with warships that I would be most personally interested in, I'm actually more interested in cultural artifacts as a whole, because as I said, gold is gold, silver is silver, gems are gems. We've got plenty of them above the water. It'd be a nice payday for whoever found what found them below the water. But they're just material objects. Whereas a ship like, I mean, okay, Syracuse is technically a private vessel, but a large warship of some description, because we know, especially in ancient times, that a lot of warships did double duty moving cargo around in times of peace, that was loaded down with a lot of cultural artifacts, especially the kind of stuff that doesn't tend to survive on land, like bronzes, for example. Something like that went down in bad weather, ideally in somewhere that would probably preserve the ship and its contents quite extensively, so probably somewhere like the Black Sea, for ancient Mediterranean societies, for instance. That would be the thing that would interest me the most, because we have, fragments of ancient civilizations here and there, but if you have a relatively large ship that's been loaded down with a bunch of what is considered to be high-value cargo, particularly in the form of artifacts, that's almost like a window into the ancient past that you probably wouldn't get almost anywhere else, especially in terms of land archaeological discoveries, unless it's some, a city that's been instantly wiped out by some massive natural catastrophe. And even then, you have to factor in what survives. But yeah, a large ship like that sinking somewhere like the Black Sea, where it's very likely to be preserved almost in totality, that would give us so much more understanding into how that society that it represented worked. That would be the thing that would interest me the most, especially stuff that we have lots of written records for, but not perhaps so much massive amounts of snapshot artifact caches like that. So, things like the Phoenicians, massively present in the ancient Mediterranean, but not so well represented in terms of, considerable amounts of artifacts found in one place as a representative cross-section of their society, the way that we have with perhaps the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans. Joey Nelson asks, I have a two-part question about Jackie Fisher. What do you think was his best idea that he never managed to push through? And conversely, what do you think was his worst idea that was actually adopted or built? I think his worst idea was probably the Courageous class battle cruisers. Now, you can make a lot of arguments one way or another. Well, are they battle cruisers or larger light cruisers? Or what are there other ideas that Fisher had that might be worse? But for me, the Courageous class are probably the worst idea. Because, well, as I've said before about them, they're far too fragile. They damage themselves with their own guns. And ultimately, while they provide a degree of useful carrier service in the interwar period, their existence means that the Royal Navy has something to work with in terms of largish high-speed hulls. And thus you get Courageous, Glorious, and Furious. Now, of course, that's not to downplay the useful early experience that Furious in particular gave the Royal Navy when it comes to operating aircraft carriers. But if they hadn't been built, there is a reasonable chance that something a little bit better in terms of shipping might actually have been built. And in particular, perhaps maybe additional Renown class, which both would have been far more useful surface combatants and potentially far better in terms of carrier conversions as well. Or if not that, then without Courageous, Glorious, and to a certain extent Furious under construction, there might have been a little bit more impetus towards completing or at least retaining one or more of the Admiral class hulls, which might have meant come Washington Naval Treaty time we could have had Admiral class carriers instead of Courageous class carriers. Or even if they are also, scrapped as they were historically and only Hood is around, well, if we don't have the Admiral class around and we don't have the Courageous class around, but there's the special exemption for the Americans and the Japanese to build what will eventually turn into Lexington, Saratoga, Akagi, and Kaga, that might actually give Britain an opening to essentially pull something similar to what they did with Nelson and Rodney and say, hey, look, we don't have anything under construction to quite the same extent. Technically, you've got some G3 keel plates, but let's not go there. And then they could have said, well, we therefore reserve the right to build two similar vessels to similar tonnage at some point in the not too distant future, at which point Britain might get a pair of 33,000 ton-ish purpose-built aircraft carriers in the 1920s, which might be rather nice, certainly a lot better than Courageous, Glorious and Poor Old Furious. But in terms of best ideas that he never quite managed to push through, I would probably say collectively, although it's a very small collective, the ideas he had for what we would essentially term fast battleships, coming at it from both directions, actually, both the X4 design that he wanted to succeed Dreadnought with, and also some of the ideas that he was pushing for with the successor to Tiger, which in some ways resembles a prototype Hood, and some of the more interesting ideas that were being batted around for the Queen Elizabeths as well. Because although he technically retires from being First Sea Lord for the first time in the beginning of 1911, between then and when he's recalled in 1914, he still has a fair bit of influence from the sidelines, and of course design ideas for the Queen Elizabeths are being batted around just before he leaves service. Now, admittedly, as I have said in the past, that the technology for a true fast battleship wasn't quite there in the 1910s and 1920s, because, well, especially in relation to Japanese efforts in the 1920s. But I think if anyone was going to come close to it, it would have been Fisher. Now, the ships he would have implemented, whether that be the more outlandish QE designs, X4, as we've mentioned, or what some people have tentatively named Leopard on the Splendid Cat principle, i.e. Tiger's hypothetical successor ship, would admittedly have been somewhat inefficient on paper compared to their contemporaries, because you would have needed, well, pretty much as you see with Hood, a very large ship to attain high speed as well as decent firepower as well as decent protection. Now, you wouldn't necessarily need a Hood-sized vessel necessarily, especially if you were talking about, small tube boiler QEs or some of the slightly larger ideas for the QEs, so on and so forth, because you don't need to reach over 30 knots. You maybe want to do 27, 28 knots, which is what the fast battleship standard would settle down at in the 1930s anyway, but they would still be somewhat larger than contemporaries for a similar amount of firepower and armour, and thus, in theory, somewhat less efficient. But it would have given the Royal Navy both an advantage at the time, if they're the only ones who can afford to build such things. How much of that, in effect, that might have had at Jutland, considering they probably would have been coming into service, especially if it's theoretical Leopard or the QEs in some other form right before Jutland, is questionable, because there would have been relatively few of them and they would have been fairly new. But especially for the longer term benefit of the Royal Navy, they would have been absolutely critical, because we saw the good service, especially that the modernised QE, so QE, Warspite and Valiant gave in World War II anyway. And if you imagine something a little bit bigger, perhaps a little bit more heavily armed, but more crucially capable of 27, 28 knots baseline and then modernised, those ships would have been massively, massively better for the Royal Navy going into the Second World War. And it would have been rather interesting at that point to see if during their modernisations, whether the Royal Navy decided, as they did with the historic QEs, to keep their speed approximately and update protection and firepower, particularly anti-aircraft firepower, or would they go more the Italian route and try and get them to go even faster still, which might be an option if you strip out all the secondary armament. The main thing that mitigates against true fast capital ships, apart from the inefficiency relative to the other types in the 1910s, is in the 1920s when you look at the Japanese efforts. By the 1920s, the necessity of much more extensive anti-torpedo boat defences and anti-aircraft defences, to a limited degree, have become apparent, and those, plus the desire for heavy secondary batteries, because the dual-purpose gun hasn't really come in at that point, plus speed and armament, etc., it all doesn't quite fit until machinery improvements in the Second World War. But if you have the 1910s and you're just going with okay-ish anti-torpedo defences and just anti-surface secondary battery, not having to worry about the anti-aircraft part or aircraft facilities as a whole, I think you could pull off something quite impressive. Would need a lot of modernisation for the Second World War, but still. Dog Bertius asks, assuming that the stray torpedo that ended up hitting HMS Edinburgh had missed or hit in a manner that didn't doom the ship, would there have been suitable facilities available in Murmansk to make enough repairs to allow her to return to the UK, or would the damage have been too severe? I think in the case of a hit elsewhere, we would probably be pushing it. I mean, to be honest, a hit elsewhere might be pushing it for the ship's survival generally, because she's already taken one body blow amidships. Where else exactly can you hit her? If you hit her right aft, then, well, your propulsion and steering's gone, so she's probably a goner. And if you hit her right forward, maybe blow the bow off, Guadalcanal style, then you'd have a ship that's got major damage amidships and now also can't be towed bow first. I mean, it might work, but you'd have to be towing her stern first, which would be very interesting in the Chinese sense of the word. So, yeah, I would doubt that a torpedo hit anywhere on the ship at that point by the stray would have allowed her to get to Murmansk, but if she somehow did, maybe you could patch her up to get her back, putting on a false bow and patching over the hole in the side. It might be possible with Murmansk facilities, but I'd be very on edge about that. If it had missed, on the other hand, and you just had to deal with, well, just the massive hole in the side from the initial torpedo hit, then yes, I think the facilities at Murmansk would have been enough to get her home, because at that stage what you would have needed, even if it would have been a bit of a crude bodge job, would be to slap a bunch of plate over the hole in the hull to stop the leaking, pump the leaks out, and even if that's almost all that you're capable of doing, as long as that is mostly watertight, you can pack and secure off the area, affected area from the inside as well, and some of her machinery is still working, so she could at least limp back home in that case. Deeks25 asks, I read that a survey of Edinburgh showed that she hadn't broken in two, or at least hadn't fully broken in two. Is this the case? And if so, what kind of adamantium was she made of? Yes, remarkably enough, the wreck on the sea floor basically kind of looks like this picture taken of her shortly before she sank, minus the funnels and the upper superstructure, which at some point have fallen or been swept off. The reason for this seems to be that, well, the Town class as a whole were actually relatively tough ships, even for cruisers, and the Edinburgh subclass, which of course was made up of Edinburgh and Belfast, were tougher still. I mean, you kind of see that when Belfast hits a magnetic mine, which should, by rights, have sunk her, and even for a regular Town class probably would have sunk her, but being Edinburgh subclass, she wasn't. And I think actually the specifics of the Edinburgh subclass are what save Edinburgh as well, because you can kind of see a little bit of a remnant of one of the roughly amidships torpedo strikes in this picture. If you look sort of down in line with the bridge superstructure and hangar, you can just about see some evidence of the starboard torpedo strike there. And I think the reason for her toughness is, well, one, her keel wasn't broken somehow, so that was still holding the ship together, and there was still some upper deck holding her together, despite this almost through and through between. But I think the main factor is, because Edinburgh and Belfast were built with their machinery relocated significantly aft to shorten up the propeller shafts, because they were worried about the effects of mining and underwater explosions on the propellers should they be hit, that meant that the area where the torpedo strikes took place is largely, much like the mine strike on Belfast, largely relatively inert spaces and very close compartmentalized spaces. That's why, if you look at a typical Town class, you have the first funnel immediately aft of the superstructure, whereas on a Edinburgh or Belfast, the first funnel, as you can see here, is actually quite significantly back. But in any case, so what this meant is that the machinery spaces, the turbine and engine rooms, were not destroyed by these impacts. They weren't directly breached. Now, there was flooding, of course, which is why she sank, but without those major void spaces being structurally compromised in a significant way, there was actually a huge amount of strength still left in the hull, what you might call the hull girder. And by blowing out all these essentially honeycomb compartments underneath the forward superstructure, while you have kind of created another large hole, the remnants around said hole are actually quite heavily crisscrossed with reinforcement beams and remnants of bulkheads and decks and so forth, which would tend to try and keep the ship together as long as the impact speed with the seabed wasn't too high, which it appears it was relatively gentle. Whereas if you'd put a major hole in the side of machinery spaces and then had, that whole compartment full of water and dragging the ship down, that would have had a much more stressful effect on the ship's hull as it went down and upon impact. And of course, you've got the heavy machinery now loose, etc., etc. So, yeah, partly just the Town class as a whole are fairly tough ships as far as cruiser standards go, but also Belfast and Edinburgh are, thanks to, in large part to that relocation of their machinery, incredibly tough ships when you hit them in locations which would otherwise have totaled most other cruisers. A.B. Coates asks, this could probably be a Wednesday video in its own right, but what happened to the French Navy after the fall of Napoleon? The Marine Nationale underwent, well, let's cover up till at least the pro-dreadnought period of the late 19th century. It underwent something of a dip and then a gradual rise again, although its political and, shall we say, technological objectives did diverge quite significantly during the post-Napoleonic 19th century. Initially, France took something of a hit, understandably, with the 1815 Treaty of Paris, some of it which's clauses were drafted in from the 1814 Treaty of Paris, which had been drawn up prior to Napoleon's last return. And one of those conditions was that where the French had built ships or bases in areas that were beyond the now borders of France, then France would get 2/3 of those back, but 1/3 would be given to whichever nation now occupied that port. So that was an immediate reduction to the Marine Nationale's strength. The Marine Nationale itself had been obviously on the losing side of a war. The British had relieved them of quite a number of ships already. But of what was left, obviously now that there wasn't a war, there wasn't a need for a wartime scale fleet, which meant that what was left of the Marine Nationale would rapidly see a lot of its older ships that had been kept around basically because they were still useful, just broken up within the first 5 years of peace. Albeit with the much reduced size of the Marine Nationale, there wasn't all that many of them left in the first place. Plus, there was a big set of war reparations and indemnities for France to pay, plus it had to pay for the maintenance of an Allied occupation army that sat in France for quite a few years. So all of that meant there wasn't a huge amount of money for new ships either. So once you enter into the 1820s, the Marine Nationale is considerably smaller than it was in the early 1810s, but what's left is essentially a small core of their more modern units, plus some ships that had been on the stocks for quite a while. There would then follow, up to the point of the ironclad era, a steady construction stream of both frigates and ships of the line, although interestingly the number of ships of the line was very close to the number of frigates built, partly because that was what the Marine Nationale was somewhat weaker in post the Napoleonic Wars, and partially because the Marine Nationale was now somewhat smaller than the Royal Navy, and there was a certain amount of a desire to catch up with the Royal Navy. And since there wasn't really the money or the industry to win a straight-up building race, in a fashion that was somewhat similar to American building programs in the 1900s and 1910s, they focused primarily on capital ship construction, although not quite to the same lopsided nature as American construction in the Dreadnought period. But this is where the technological and political objectives seem to split, because technologically, France remains at the forefront of warship development for quite a considerable period of time in the 19th century. They are the first to introduce the shell gun, or the Péhan gun, on a widespread scale. They're also obviously the first to introduce a dedicated, purpose-built, steam-powered ship of the line in the Napoleon. They're the first to introduce the ironclad warship in the Gloire, and this is essentially from a technological perspective, because having realised they can't catch up with and outbuild the Royal Navy, they're hoping to out-quality them with new and inventive technology. This takes a little bit of a hit, ironically enough, because of their development of the ironclad, because it turns out Britain's iron construction industry is far superior to the French. So the Marine Nationale takes a bit of a wobble in that period. They try, again, various new and inventive things, but technologically speaking, the Royal Navy gets a fair bit ahead of the curve. And then you get into the pre-dreadnought period, which is where we're kind of cutting off this very brief summary. And at that point, you have things like the French steel industry suddenly coming on quite significantly, as well as French improvements in electrical technology, which allow them to catch up and, in some cases, surpass the Royal Navy, technologically speaking, once again. But politically, there was actually a surprising amount of cooperation between the British and the French during the 19th century. Now, France did, of course, go off to do its own thing in terms of maintaining and expanding its colonial empire for a good chunk of the 19th century. But in terms of major fleet deployments, if you look through, you'd actually be surprised. The vast majority are in cooperation with either just the British, i.e. the two largest naval powers on the planet, ganging up on somebody, or in a broader coalition, which includes both France and Britain. And interestingly enough, where that generally drops off is also kind of the period where, technologically speaking, the Marine Nationale is a little bit on the back foot in sort of the 1860s through 1880s period. So although it's the rise of Germany at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century that will finally force Britain and France to ally formally, and there is a bit of colonial tension between them immediately before that, there's actually a relatively firm basis of Anglo-French cooperation throughout most of the 19th century on which to build what would eventually become the Entente Cordiale. Patrick Donnelly asks, what's your advice for building an alternate history timeline? For the last year and a bit, I've been working on one where it looked small, but it could evolve into something bigger. Well, the process I tend to follow for when people ask, what if this happened, how would that affect naval construction, or what if they built this ship instead of that ship, is effectively to go, okay, what is the end point, or if I guess you're starting the story, the starting point, the fixed point at which you wish to have your narrative, and what are the changes that you want to have reflected at that point. Then you have to consider, one, how large are those changes compared to historical timelines, and two, what kind of decisions would be needed to drive those changes. Because a political decision to make a change that's necessary would be relatively easy to do compared to a technological divergence. So if, for example, if you want to have a more speed-focused Royal Navy battle line going into the Second World War, then that's actually not too difficult to do, because that requires a slight change in political decision around the time of the Washington Naval Treaty, perhaps to build a modified version of the F-3 battlecruiser instead of the O-3, which will turn into the Nelson class. If, however, over the same period of time you want, let's say, the Marine Nationale to have Normandy and Lyon class battleships at a minimum, or perhaps one generation further still, instead of Corbett's and Britannia's going into the Second World War, that requires a rather drastic financial and technological shift in what happens with the French economy, and particularly the naval economy, in the aftermath of World War I, which means you probably have to reach into even greater changes, such as the First World War generally going somewhat better for France on land, or perhaps France somehow managing to argue for a much more significant amount of reparations from Germany in the aftermath of World War One. Let's say, for example, the Versailles Treaty reflects more what Britain and France wanted and less of the slightly watered-down version courtesy of President Wilson, at which point that in turn could lead to more of a rupture with the United States. If Wilson basically gets told, sod off, we did most of the fighting, we're going to take Germany for all it's worth. But then again, obviously, given that Wilson's government is out by the early 1920s, there might have been a time of repairing Franco-US and to a certain extent Anglo-US relations. But you see, this is a far more complicated environment, even though the basic premise of we're slightly changing the battle line of one of the major navies is essentially the same. Because when it comes to political decisions, you can either just say, well, I'm going to slightly change a few factors here, so this person is going to make a slightly different decision, or you could make a slightly larger change and go, okay, well, perhaps this political individual isn't going to make that decision, but at this election or that selection or whatever, this other person who perhaps would be more amenable to do that was in the running, so I'm just going to tweak things slightly in my timeline so they are in power, so they make what for your timeline is the correct decision. Whereas when it comes to simple finances or technology, then it becomes a lot more complicated. And the other thing I would say is that once you've got your kind of divergence point, try and look into historical precedents for how things changed somewhat, and then bring not exactly those incidents, but similar incidents in between your divergence point and the point you want to reach, in order to more thoroughly explain how you've gotten to the stage that you have. And for that, you could use various war games, such as the US Navy's fleet problems or the Royal Navy's yearly exercises, which informed how they made judgment calls in terms of what kind of ships they needed and what kind of tactics they could use. Obviously, if you have different ships, that's going to involve the war games going slightly differently or involving different scenarios, but look at how some of those affected the navies in question and then have something similar happen, but obviously with a different lesson learned. And also, don't be afraid to look for external actors, as in if you're trying to change the timeline for a specific navy, obviously this is a naval channel, don't just look at the admirals and politicians who are in charge of that navy, look at the navies and the politicians from other countries whose decisions could affect the decisions that were made for that navy. So, for example, if you wanted to construct a timeline where the bulk of the Marine Nationale fights on against Nazi Germany, if you were looking purely internally, if you don't want to do something massively radical, like come up with some timeline where Admiral Darlan isn't in charge, you would have to completely switch Darlan's personality and somehow get him to go with fighting on the British side instead of effectively, as it turned out, collaborating with the Germans. Whereas if you include the wider scale of what the Axis powers might have done, then you could instead, and perhaps more plausibly, have the Axis powers demand the surrender of either the whole or a large chunk of the Marine Nationale to Axis hands, because we know that was one of Darlan's red lines. And given what we know of Darlan's personality, it's far more plausible that an Axis demand like that might lead him to flip the table and go, screw it, we're fighting on the Allies' side instead, as opposed to just having him come to this kind of revelation internally when he thinks the Germans are going to win the war. Maximus Tillman IV asks, the Great Hurricane of 1780 is listed as the deadliest hurricane in the Western Hemisphere and perhaps the strongest, with wind gusts approximating 200 miles per hour. It tore through the Caribbean, wrecking both the French ships as well as Vice Admiral Peter Parker's ships. How much of an effect did this storm have on the American Revolutionary War, and what does a sailing ship do when unable to avoid such a storm? In terms of what a sailing ship does, if you've got a storm that bad, then probably your best recourse of action is pray for divine intervention, because that's pretty much all that's going to save you. The only practical measures you can make in the face of such a storm would be either to try and run before the storm and hope that by catching the leading edge and the strong winds that come with it, you might be able to run ahead of the storm's rate of advance, if not forever, at least long enough to find a port. And related to that would be that even if the storm overhauls you, obviously it's going to gradually build in intensity. So essentially what you want to do is run for shelter. Ideally a harbour, a very heavily sheltered harbour. And if you can't do that, then at least perhaps in the lee of an island or some other large landmass which will physically block the worst effects of the storm if you stick close to it. In terms of the effect of the storm on the American Revolutionary War, it is somewhat difficult to quantify because although there were losses and damage to both British and French ships, more so British than French, ultimately the amount of shipping that was sunk in terms of warships, while tragic, wasn't a colossal amount in terms of the overall size of the British fleet. The number of ships damaged and therefore out of action until they could be repaired was possibly a slightly larger impact, but also at the very end of 1780 and going into early 1781, there wasn't any particular major naval engagement where you could argue that the presence of a handful of more frigates or an extra ship of the line or two would have made all that much difference. So on the one hand, you could say that the storm ultimately didn't have a huge effect on the American Revolutionary War, but on the other hand, there's, I think, two potential lines of inquiry. There's the, well, what if those ships hadn't been sunk more immediately, because obviously it weakens the British position in the Caribbean more so than the French. So without that hurricane, could the British have wrapped up operations in the Caribbean a bit more convincingly, which potentially would have freed up more ships to head north, which then could have had a cascading effect on the American East Coast? Or perhaps on a more limited scale, even if we assume that not a huge amount changes in the Caribbean, by having a handful of extra ships of the line and a few more frigates around generally, could that mean, for example, that the British fleet that fights the Battle of the Chesapeake or Battle of the Virginia Capes, depending on what you want to call it, might have a few extra ships? And if it has a few extra ships, will they be a bit more aggressive in engaging? And if they do engage and manage to drive off de Grasse, then do they manage to resupply and reinforce Cornwallis? Therefore, does the Siege of Yorktown go the way of the French and the Americans? And potentially that could be a big pivot point on the American Revolutionary War, but it's kind of almost butterfly flaps wings scenarios at that point. Tankodromis asks, what if HMS Tiger becomes the gunnery training ship instead of HMS Iron Duke? Would she be refitted to serve in World War II? And would it be possible to rebore the 13.5-inch guns to use ammunition from the King George V's or fit twin 14-inch turrets from the King George V class? And how would this theoretically refitted Tiger be used? Realistically, no, she probably wouldn't be refitted for service in World War II because she'd be far too old and worn out by the time World War II rolls around. I mean, you know, the Royal Navy in real life, it wanted to refit a lot of its ships, including obviously Hood, Repulse, Malaya and Barham, but didn't manage to get round to it because of limited funds, limited dockyard space, etc. So given the fighting value of any one of those four ships I just listed is considerably greater than the fighting value of Tiger, realistically that's not going to happen. However, if you wanted to construct a scenario in which she was refitted for service in World War II, perhaps Britain starts rearming a little bit earlier, or otherwise somehow retains a bit more of its dockyard capacity, or is just prepared to throw a bit more money at the problem, because there were physically the dockyards if you really wanted to throw additional money at rebuilding the Navy in the mid to late 1930s. I suppose it could potentially be done, at which point there is 13.5-inch ammunition still around, so the cheapest way would be to just keep her armament as is. However, if you're absolutely determined to also rearm her because ultimately, let's face it, that 13.5-inch hammer is going to be getting a bit long in the tooth, then you wouldn't want to replace her turrets whole scale with King George V twin turrets, both for size on barbette reasons and also because being battleship turrets, the KGV's 14-inch turrets are considerably heavier, almost half again, and pretty much half again as heavy. But equally, because of ammunition concerns, I don't think you'd want to bore out the 13.5-inch guns, but weight-wise, although dimensionally obviously things are slightly different, but weight-wise, the KGV's 14-inch guns are remarkably close in weight to the 13.5-inch. Now, of course, that does mean if you just take Tiger's existing turrets and swap out 13.5-inch for 14-inch guns, you are also going to have to replace the ammunition hoist system, etc., all of which is going to add weight, but would give you a continuity of logistics with existing shell manufacture, which would be quite nice. And I suppose if you're going to do a deep rebuild along the lines of Renown, then you probably could afford to do this. Now, how would you use the ship? Well, a lot of it would depend on how you refit it in terms other than the main armament. Personally, I would look at the ship and go, okay, even if we've got 14-inch guns, realistically, in order to have a decent anti-aircraft battery, and we're going to be replacing machinery as well, you're probably going to have to lose a turret. So that's probably going to be the sort of a midships turret. So you're going to end up with a 6-gun ship with 14-inch guns, aka a mini Renown. Now, that does leave you with a fair number of options. You'd be saving quite a bit of weight by eliminating the barbette, the turret, the guns, etc. from that position. And your funnels are likely to be taking up less deck space because of more modern machinery, even if you do gain a few knots. You're stripping out, obviously, the secondary battery, but this does leave you with the potential of running a very strong secondary battery with twin 4.5s and a big cluster of what will probably be pom-poms, either quadruple or octuple, roughly speaking, where that turret used to be. And probably a hangar and aircraft operation area as well, given that this will probably be the mid-1930s. I don't think that you'll be able to massively improve the ship's armour in terms of belt armour. You might put a little bit more deck armour on to help resist bombs and so forth, but essentially what you would have created is a cruiser killer, because it won't have the firepower or the armour to go toe-to-toe with much of anything in terms of capital ships, except maybe the Italian refits, although that would still be a little bit sketchy, and similarly with the Scharnhorsts, again, somewhat sketchy. I wouldn't necessarily want to put the refitted Tiger up against a Scharnhorst directly, but perhaps if it operated with Renown or Repulse, then together they would have a reasonable advantage over 2 Scharnhorsts. But the flip side is you would have a dramatic advantage against anything heavy cruiser scale, even something massively overweight like a Hipper, at which point I would make the refitted Tiger the flagship of a cruiser squadron, and then potentially, running around the Mediterranean, perhaps leading Cunningham's cruisers, something like that, or being used as an independent raider hunter-killer early on for going after things like the Sheer or the Graf Spee. That kind of thing would suit it very well. And with a fairly heavy anti-aircraft battery, which perhaps will be augmented even further once the aircraft launch facilities are eliminated in the middle of the war in favour of more radar, you might very well see her also running carrier escort, so perhaps on Force H as an alternative to Renown, which would release Renown, which would be somewhat more capable to go off and do capital ship things. And speaking of Renown, Seb Dove asks, glass cannon warships, what are the best examples of massively overarmed and under-armoured warships that saw success in fighting other warships in the steam and steel era, excluding monitors? Well, yeah, as you might have guessed, Renown, I think, is probably the example par excellence. She survives the entire Second World War and gets stuck into quite a number of engagements when on paper, theoretically, she has no right to be doing so, because yes, she has a relatively heavy armament, but on paper her armour scheme is very weak and absolutely should not be put into any kind of capital ship grade engagement, and yet she consistently does so, particularly early in the war, and in fact has to be specifically warned off by the Admiralty in some cases because they're worried she might end up biting off something even bigger than what she can chew. For example, she is in the offing in the final destruction of Bismarck, so it could have been King George V, Renown and Rodney against Bismarck, but Renown is specifically by name ordered not to engage because the Admiralty is concerned about the weakness of her armour should Bismarck score a hit on her. To a limited degree, I guess you could put Salt Lake City in the Battle of Komandorsky Islands into that category as well. She has a slightly insane number of 8-inch guns for a ship that actually does comply with the Washington Naval Treaty limits on cruiser displacement, in exchange for which she has practically no armour. And again, on paper, by all right, she should have been horrifically blown to pieces at the Battle of Komandorsky Islands, but although she takes a few heavy hits, she just about manages to pull off survival and also a technical victory. And finally for this week, 22NF2 asks, if the two 15-inch guns mounted in front of the Imperial War Museum in London were raised to 45 degrees, loaded with a standard shell as per World War II and fired, where would those shells land? Also, what are the largest World War II era capital ship grade guns preserved today, and where are they? If you want to be very technical, I think the largest World War II era capital ship grade guns currently preserved would be whatever's left of the 18-inch gun at the Dahlgren Surface Warfare Center in Virginia in the US. But of course that was only ever a prototype and not mounted on a ship, but was, a capital ship grade gun that could have been mounted on a ship. If you want largest World War II era capital ship grade gun that was actually mounted on a ship and then saw service, well, go to any one of the 4 Iowas and have a look at their 16-inch 50s. As for the range of the guns that you asked for, unfortunately, there isn't any gunnery data for elevation at 45 degrees with standard charges in World War II for 15-inch guns because, well, the maximum elevation was just a fraction over 30 degrees, so that's all they ever bothered to calculate for. There are calculations available for these guns using supercharges in coastal defense positions, and that actually extends all the way up to about 50 degrees. So I'm going to slightly redo your question because that is a value that I can actually calculate for. So looking at the range data for a 15-inch 42 in a coastal fortification mounting, which can elevate therefore to 45 degrees, and using supercharges, that gives us an estimated range at 45 degrees of elevation of about 43,000 yards, give or take a little bit. And being at such a high elevation, we actually don't have the problem for once of the shells theoretically smashing into a building within the first few hundred yards of them being fired. The shells would then travel well north of London. They'd clear London entirely. In fact, they'd clear north of Welwyn Garden City, which is somewhat north of the traditional borders of London. And luckily for us, in terms of calculation, they are pointed almost directly north. And it turns out the shells would land in the Woodhall estate, which is just north of Hertford, just to the, northeast of Welwyn Garden City, to the southeast of Stevenage, about half a mile to the east of the actual manor house itself. And that brings us to an end for this week's Drydock. Thank you very much, everybody, for listening, and I hope to see you again in another video fairly soon.